Flight 142 was already buzzing with energy as passengers settled in, stashing bags in overhead compartments and finding their seats. Marcus Hale stepped onto the plane, maneuvering carefully down the narrow aisle, politely offering a soft, "Excuse me," as he passed by standing travelers. His seat was near the emergency exit, a few rows back. Across the cabin, Samantha Brooks lowered her magazine slightly, eyes narrowing as she noticed Marcus the moment he boarded. His calm, composed demeanor seemed to stand out to her. She couldn't pinpoint why, but something about him felt different. As he settled in, adjusting his bag and pulling out a book, Samantha found herself watching closely. Her fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, though she hadn't processed a word of the article in front of her. "Excuse me," she called softly, raising her hand as Claire, one of the flight attendants, passed by. Claire paused, her professional smile unwavering. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Samantha shifted slightly, lowering her voice. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus, who was now turning the pages of his book. "That man, near the emergency exit? Are you sure it's safe for someone like him to sit there?" Claire followed her gaze. Marcus sat quietly, absorbed in his reading, his expression calm. Claire's smile stayed intact. "I assure you, ma'am, every passenger on board has passed security. Seating arrangements are in line with safety protocols." Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. "I just thought, with everything you hear these days, it's better to be cautious, isn't it?" Claire's pleasant smile remained, though her eyes hardened ever so slightly. "If you have any specific concerns, please let me know. Our priority is to ensure all passengers feel safe and comfortable." With a polite nod, Claire continued down the aisle. Samantha watched her walk away, irritation bubbling beneath the surface. How could the crew be so dismissive? She shook her head and returned her attention to Marcus, who was now reaching into his bag. Her mind raced. What is he doing? What could he be carrying? Marcus, unaware of the scrutiny, pulled out a small bottle of medication, briefly checking the label before tucking it back into his carry-on. He exhaled, letting the stress of the past week slowly melt away. The hum of the plane became a soothing backdrop as he returned to his book. Claire continued with pre-flight checks, eventually reaching the rear of the plane where she exchanged glances with her colleague, Daniel. Leaning closer, she whispered, "Keep an eye on seat 4B. Passenger in 19A seems uneasy about him." Daniel nodded, glancing casually toward Marcus. "Any reason for concern?" Claire shrugged. "Not really, just one of those feelings. She seems a little too fixated." Daniel's brow arched, but he didn't press further. They dealt with their fair share of uneasy flyers. This didn't feel like much, yet. Samantha shifted again, crossing her legs tightly as her eyes remained glued to Marcus. The low hum of the plane engines grew louder, signaling imminent takeoff. Marcus placed his book down and gazed out the window, his face serene. But Samantha's mind raced. Her grip on the armrest tightened. Something wasn't right. As the plane taxied down the runway, Samantha leaned back, her eyes never leaving Marcus. If no one else was going to do something, she might have to handle it herself. The plane smoothly ascended, leveling off as the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 142 to Denver. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin slowly eased into routine. Some passengers retrieved laptops, while others began browsing in-flight entertainment. Marcus relaxed further, the clouds rolling by as he peered out the window. He unzipped his carry-on, pulling out a small water bottle. As he did, he caught sight of Samantha watching him out of the corner of his eye. He hesitated, wondering if she was simply glancing around, then dismissed the thought and resumed reading. But Samantha's unease only grew. What was in that bag? Marcus's subtle movements, the careful way he zipped it up, felt deliberate, calculated even. Was he hiding something? Her eyes darted around the cabin. Most passengers were lost in their own world, but Samantha couldn't understand how no one else noticed. She glanced toward Claire further down the aisle, contemplating whether to call her over again. Marcus remained oblivious, sipping his water and flipping through his book. He had no idea that just a few rows behind him, Samantha's mind spun scenarios that could change the course of the flight. Samantha Brooks couldn't shake the gnawing feeling twisting in her stomach. The more Marcus Hale subtly checked his bag, the more convinced she became that something was amiss. Unable to let it go, she raised her hand again, signaling to Claire. The flight attendant noticed her immediately and approached with the same warm, professional smile. "Yes, ma'am? Is there something I can get for you?" Claire's tone was light, as if expecting a simple drink request or adjustment to the air vent. Samantha leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "The man near the emergency exit. Marcus. He's been checking his bag repeatedly. He looks nervous. I really think someone should take a closer look at what he's carrying." Claire's gaze drifted over to Marcus, who was casually reading his book. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but, as I mentioned earlier, we can't search a passenger's belongings without cause. He hasn't done anything out of the ordinary." Samantha's lips pressed tightly together. "You can't seriously think this is normal? People like him." Her voice trailed, eyes narrowing. "They always seem fine until they aren't. I've seen the stories. Something happens, and everyone says they should have acted sooner." Claire's smile didn't waver, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, her professional guard tightening. "Ma'am, I assure you that our security protocols are thorough. Every passenger was screened before boarding. Please try to relax. If you notice anything more specific, don't hesitate to let me know." Samantha crossed her arms, exhaling sharply. "You'll regret it if something happens," she muttered just loud enough for Claire to hear. Claire, though accustomed to passengers like this, couldn't shake a lingering discomfort. There was something intense, determined, about Samantha's expression. As Claire walked down the aisle, she cast a brief glance toward Marcus, who happened to look up from his book. Their eyes met for a fleeting second before Marcus offered a polite nod. Claire smiled in return, though the moment sat heavy in her chest. Samantha tracked Claire's every move, frustration mounting as the flight attendant disappeared down the aisle. She glanced around, hoping to catch the eye of another passenger. Surely someone else had noticed Marcus's behavior. Turning slightly, Samantha leaned toward the middle-aged woman seated next to her, who was quietly reading a magazine. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Did you notice that man near the exit? Doesn't he seem off to you?" The woman blinked, lowering her magazine briefly to glance at Marcus. He was calmly flipping a page, completely unaware of the scrutiny. "I don't know," the woman replied with a hesitant shrug. "He looks fine to me. What's the problem?" Samantha frowned. "He's been checking his bag, over and over, like he's hiding something. I told the flight attendant, but they aren't doing anything. Don't you think it's better to be cautious?" The woman tilted her head, giving Marcus another glance before sighing lightly. "Maybe. But if there was a real issue, I think the crew would take care of it." She returned to her magazine without another word. Samantha's jaw tightened. How could everyone be so blind? Fine. If no one else was going to take this seriously, she would. Her eyes never left Marcus, as she tracked every movement. Every time his hand brushed the zipper of his bag, she felt her pulse quicken. Meanwhile, Marcus remained blissfully unaware. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his position, before returning to his book, occasionally sipping from his water bottle. The soft hum of the engines and the tranquil view outside the window settled him further. His thoughts drifted to his upcoming meeting in Denver, mentally reviewing the key points he needed to cover. But Samantha's world was far from peaceful. Her mind raced through every headline she had ever read about suspicious passengers. Every cautious glance Marcus gave toward his bag only fueled her growing certainty that something was wrong. The atmosphere aboard Flight 142 remained calm, the low murmur of conversation and the rustle of snack bags filling the cabin. Passengers scrolled through in-flight entertainment or quietly dozed. But for Samantha, none of it mattered. Each time Marcus shifted slightly or repositioned his bag, Samantha's heart thudded harder. Why wasn't anyone paying attention? Her frustration burned, bubbling just beneath the surface. She wasn't going to let him out of her sight. One wrong move, just one, and she'd be ready. Samantha Brooks felt her heart pounding harder with each passing moment. She couldn't believe no one else saw what she did. Marcus Hale's subtle bag checks screamed suspicious to her, and the thought of sitting by idly gnawed at her. She leaned toward the elderly man next to her, keeping her voice low. "Excuse me, have you noticed that man near the emergency exit? He keeps checking his bag. Doesn't that seem odd to you?" The older gentleman squinted through his reading glasses, glancing briefly toward Marcus before returning to his crossword puzzle. I hadn't noticed anything unusual, he replied, barely looking up. I'm sure it's nothing. Samantha's jaw tightened. How can they all be so blind? She scanned the cabin, hoping to catch the attention of someone, anyone who might share her concern. Her eyes landed on a young woman across the aisle, casually watching Marcus with mild curiosity. Samantha leaned over, lowering her voice. Pardon me, but have you noticed that man near the exit? Doesn't he seem strange to you? I think he's hiding something in that bag. The young woman glanced at Marcus, then back at Samantha. Her polite, neutral expression didn't change. I don't know. He's just reading, she replied cautiously. Is there a problem? Samantha's patience snapped. Yes, he's been acting suspicious since we boarded. He keeps checking that bag like there's something dangerous inside. I told the flight attendant, but she's ignoring it. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry? The woman shifted uncomfortably. Maybe, but I think the crew knows how to handle these things. Samantha's voice rose slightly. And what if it's too late by then? What if something happens and no one listens? I know I'm not the only one who feels this way. A few nearby passengers turned toward Samantha. Their curiosity piqued. Eyes flickered toward Marcus, though he remained unaware, his attention still on his book. Further down the aisle, Claire noticed the commotion and made her way toward Samantha's seat. She leaned in, her voice calm but firm. Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice. We don't want to disturb other passengers. What's the issue here? Samantha pointed directly at Marcus, frustration flashing across her face. I've been telling you. He's suspicious. He's checking his bag repeatedly, and I know he's hiding something. You need to search it. Claire took a slow breath, her training kicking in. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but as I've mentioned, we can't search passengers' belongings without evidence of a real threat. I assure you we are monitoring the situation. Samantha's voice grew louder, cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. Monitoring? That's just another word for doing nothing. What happens when it's too late? Is that what you're waiting for? Passengers exchanged murmurs, some concerned, others clearly irritated. Marcus finally looked up, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. His gaze met Samantha's for a fleeting moment, confusion flickering across his face. Claire's attention snapped back to Samantha. The last thing she wanted was a full-blown scene. Ma'am, I understand you're worried, but raising your voice isn't going to help. Please calm down, or I'll have to notify the captain. Samantha's frustration boiled over. She pushed to her feet, her face flushed. No, I won't sit down while you ignore this. Something's not right. Heads turned across the cabin, whispers rippling as passengers leaned in to watch the unfolding confrontation. Claire placed a gentle but firm hand on Samantha's arm. Ma'am, please sit down. Let's discuss this calmly. Samantha shook Claire's hand off, pointing directly at Marcus. He's hiding something in that bag, and I demand you search it now. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, though his demeanor stayed calm. He closed his book, placing it carefully on his lap. His voice was level, almost quiet. Ma'am, I assure you there's nothing dangerous in my bag. I'm just trying to enjoy this flight like everyone else. Samantha's eyes blazed with indignation. A peaceful flight? You expect us to believe that? What are you hiding? Claire stepped between them, her voice firm but composed. That's enough. We're not having this discussion here. Ma'am, please take your seat. Sir, thank you for your patience. Turning toward the passengers, Claire's voice shifted to address the growing audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. There is no cause for alarm. I ask that you return to your seats. Despite her composed words, Claire could feel the unease brewing as whispers carried across the rows. She signaled discreetly to Daniel, her colleague, who quickly stepped forward. Together, they gently guided Samantha back into her seat. Though she resisted, her protests continuing under her breath. Marcus remained seated, his expression unreadable as he observed the interaction. He felt the weight of the passengers' eyes on him, but kept his focus steady, refusing to be drawn into the unfolding drama. Claire moved toward the front of the cabin, speaking softly into the intercom. She had to notify the captain of the disturbance. As she hung up, she glanced back at Samantha, still seated but rigid with indignation. Marcus met Claire's gaze and nodded subtly in thanks. Claire nodded back, grateful for his calm response, but fully aware this was far from over. As Samantha sank back into her seat, the hum of the engine seemed louder than before. Her heart pounded, but not from fear, from frustration. Marcus Hale quietly zipped his bag and placed it under his seat, lifting his book once more. He turned a page slowly, aware that many eyes were still on him. But he didn't flinch. This wasn't his first encounter with misplaced suspicion, and he doubted it would be his last. Claire lingered for a moment, scanning the cabin for any remaining tension. The murmurs had died down, but a few passengers were still whispering, casting glances in Samantha's direction. Samantha felt their stares burning into her. She crossed her arms tightly, glaring out the window as if the clouds could validate her feelings. How could they all be so naive? Marcus didn't look at her, but he could feel the weight of her eyes on him. Every time she shifted, every rustle of her clothing, it felt like a quiet storm still brewing just behind him. Claire returned to the front, leaning briefly toward Daniel, her fellow flight attendant. "Keep an eye on 14A. She whispered. "I think she's done for now, but just in case." Daniel nodded, giving a subtle glance toward Samantha. "She doesn't seem like the type to let things go easily." "No," Claire agreed softly. "She doesn't." As Claire resumed her duties, Marcus let out a slow breath, grounding himself in the pages of his book. He wished this flight would end sooner. Samantha, meanwhile, couldn't shake the lingering doubts from her mind. It didn't make sense. A case full of medication? That was too simple. Too neat. The perfect cover. Her eyes flicked to the seatbelt sign, wishing it would flash on so she could at least justify getting up again. But for now, she was stuck. Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman Samantha had spoken to earlier leaned slightly toward her. "You know," the woman said quietly, "sometimes we think we're seeing danger when it's just someone living their life." Samantha stiffened. "I know what I saw." The woman gave a small shrug, opening her magazine again. "Maybe. But from what I saw, it looked like a man reading a book." Samantha didn't respond. A few rows ahead, Marcus turned the page of his novel, trying to lose himself in the story. But no matter how hard he tried, the tension sat with him like an unwelcome passenger, reminding him that sometimes prejudice boards flights long before the plane leaves the ground. Marcus Hale held the small plastic case of medication up for Samantha Brooks and Claire to see. His voice was calm, unwavering. "This is what's in my bag," Marcus said plainly. "It's heart medication. I have a condition, and I need to keep it with me at all times." Claire exhaled quietly, relieved. "You see, ma'am, there's nothing dangerous here," she said, turning to Samantha with a soft but firm tone. "Let's move on and finish this flight peacefully." But Samantha's expression twisted in disbelief. She shook her head, stepping closer to Marcus. No, that's not it. That can't be everything. You're lying. You have to be." Marcus didn't flinch. "Ma'am, I'm not lying. This is the truth. Please sit down." Samantha's eyes darted wildly around the cabin, searching the faces of the other passengers, desperate for someone to share her suspicion. "Can't you all see it? He's trying to trick us. This isn't right. We have to search him properly." Claire stepped forward, her posture firm. "Ma'am, that's enough. Please sit down now, or I will have to take further action." But Samantha ignored her. Her eyes were locked onto Marcus, as if she were seconds from lunging for his bag. Before she could make another move, Marcus gently but firmly caught her wrist mid-reach. His touch was firm, but his expression remained calm and composed. "Ma'am," Marcus said softly, "please don't do this. There's no need for this kind of behavior." Samantha yanked her hand back as if burned, her eyes wide and wild. She stumbled a step backward, pointing accusingly at Marcus. "You're all in on it, aren't you? You're protecting him? You don't see it, but I do." Claire quickly signaled to Daniel, who had been watching closely. He stepped forward, calm but ready to intervene. "Ma'am," Claire said quietly but firmly, "please come with us. Let's have a word at the back of the plane." Samantha hesitated, her eyes scanning the faces watching her. Some sympathetic, others glaring with irritation. The weight of their silent judgment pressed down on her, but her gaze inevitably returned to Marcus. Still, with no support and Claire's unrelenting calm, Samantha reluctantly turned and allowed herself to be escorted to the rear of the cabin. Marcus watched her leave, feeling the tension in the cabin ease slightly as she disappeared behind the curtain near the galley. He exhaled slowly, picking up his book once again. The hum of whispers filled the space around him, but Marcus tuned them out, letting the steady words on the page draw him away from the stairs. Claire, now back at the front, glanced over her shoulder toward Marcus and gave him a small, grateful nod. He returned it subtly, a silent acknowledgement of the tension they were both holding back. The plane cruised steadily west, clouds drifting lazily beyond the windows. But inside, the atmosphere felt like a taut string, ready to snap at the slightest tug. Samantha sat rigidly in the back, arms crossed, her face flushed with anger. Daniel stood nearby, arms folded, his watchful eye keeping her pinned in place. "I'm telling you," Samantha muttered, her voice tight but quiet. "He's lying. People like him. Always a story, always an excuse. He's dangerous. I know it." Daniel glanced toward Claire, who had just entered the rear galley. Claire's calm presence seemed to settle the air. "Ma'am," Claire said gently, kneeling beside Samantha's seat, "I understand that you're concerned, but Marcus Hale showed us his medication. There's no reason to believe he poses any threat. Your reaction is causing more disruption than anything else." Samantha shook her head stubbornly, her eyes burning with frustration. "You don't see it. He's fooling all of you." Claire sighed quietly, recognizing the futility of arguing. She nodded toward Daniel. "Ma'am, we need to ensure the safety of all passengers," Daniel added, his voice firmer. "If you continue to cause a disturbance, we'll have no choice but to involve security once we land." Samantha's eyes widened slightly. She leaned back, her lips pressed into a tight line. "You'll regret not listening to me," she muttered. Claire straightened and decided to leave Samantha in Daniel's care. Returning to the front, she scanned the cabin, catching lingering glances from a few curious passengers. As she passed Marcus's row, she slowed. Marcus looked up from his book, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Mr. Hale," Claire said softly, leaning down. "I apologize for the disturbance. Is there anything you need?" Marcus shook his head gently. "No, thank you. I understand these things happen. I appreciate how you've handled it." Claire hesitated, lowering her voice. "I just wanted to make sure there are no misunderstandings. If you need anything, please let us know. Your comfort and safety are important to us." Marcus nodded, sensing her sincerity. "I appreciate it. Thank you." Claire offered a small smile before continuing down the aisle. Passengers who had been watching the interaction quickly turned their heads, pretending not to have been staring. Marcus returned to his book, but the weight of the earlier confrontation lingered. Even as the hum of the engines remained steady, he could feel the tension clinging to the air around him, like a fog that refused to lift. Still, Marcus remained calm. He had faced far worse moments in life, and in the end, the best way forward was always with patience and grace. Marcus Hale watched as Claire disappeared down the aisle, giving him a small, reassuring smile before moving to check on other passengers. He appreciated her professionalism, but could still feel the weight of curious glances lingering on him. The soft hum of whispered conversations followed her departure, and Marcus found it hard to focus on his book. The tension sat heavy in the air, thick and unmoving. Marcus had been in difficult situations before, but something about this felt different, more personal. He took a steadying breath, his fingers resting lightly on the pages before him. This needed to end. Slowly, Marcus placed his book on the seat beside him and stood up. The soft shuffle of his shoes on the carpet was enough to draw nearby attention. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his badge, something he rarely felt the need to display in public. As he walked down the aisle, stopping just beside Claire, his voice was calm but projected enough to carry. "Excuse me, everyone. May I have your attention for a moment?" The cabin hushed. Heads turned. Passengers who had been pretending not to stare now faced him fully. Marcus held up the badge for all to see. "My name is Detective Marcus Hale. I'm with the Chicago Police Department. I've been on assignment, and the medication in my bag is for a heart condition I manage daily. I apologize if my actions caused concern, but I want to assure you there's no threat here." Silence filled the cabin. Some passengers exchanged quiet glances, while others nodded, visibly relieved. Claire's gaze softened as Marcus turned to her with a small, appreciative nod. But the stillness didn't last long. From the back of the plane, Samantha's voice rang out, sharp and indignant. "You're lying. This is just a cover." Marcus turned to face her. Samantha stood in the rear section, eyes wild with disbelief. "How do we know that badge is real?" she demanded, stepping forward. "How do we know you're not using it to smuggle something dangerous?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, if you'd like, you can call the department listed on the back of the badge. They'll verify my identity. I'm simply trying to get to Los Angeles and do my job, just like everyone else." Samantha's face flushed with anger. "I don't believe you. This is a trick. You can't fool me." The cabin shifted uneasily. Passengers began murmuring again, but this time the tone had shifted, not toward Marcus, but toward Samantha. Marcus saw the panic flicker behind her eyes, the kind that no logical answer could calm. "Ma'am," Marcus said softly, keeping his voice gentle but firm, "I understand you're afraid. But I promise you, there's nothing to fear from me. Let's finish this flight without any more trouble. When we land, the authorities can verify everything." Samantha's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling as she scanned the faces around her. Most passengers looked at her with pity or discomfort, but none with agreement. She was alone. Claire stepped forward, her voice a quiet but clear reminder of authority. "Ma'am, please take your seat. We've spoken with Detective Hale. Everything is under control." Samantha hesitated, her hands trembling at her sides. Slowly she turned, glancing over her shoulder at Marcus one last time before sinking into her seat near the back of the plane. Marcus watched her carefully, waiting for another protest, but Samantha's eyes dropped to the floor, and she said nothing. "Thank you," Marcus whispered to Claire as he returned to his seat. She nodded. "Thank you for stepping forward. I think it helped put some minds at ease." Marcus lowered himself into his seat, picking up his book again, though he barely glanced at the words. The unease wasn't gone. It had simply shifted to the back of the plane, where Samantha sat in silence. For the next few minutes, the flight carried on quietly. Conversations resumed, and a sense of normalcy began to return. Claire moved gracefully through the aisles, offering smiles and reassurances where needed, though her eyes drifted toward the back every so often to check on Samantha. Samantha sat with her arms crossed, lips pursed, and eyes distant. The stares of passengers hadn't left her mind. She felt their judgment, their doubt. How could they not see what she did? Why couldn't they understand? But she was alone now. And for the rest of the flight, that fact wouldn't change. Marcus kept his head down, reading quietly but remaining acutely aware of his surroundings. He had no doubt that the incident wasn't truly over until the plane landed. At the rear of the cabin, Daniel kept a watchful eye on Samantha Brooks. She sat with her arms crossed, her face locked in a mask of stubborn defiance. Daniel had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was something different this time. The intensity of Samantha's fear and frustration felt unsettling. As Claire approached, Daniel leaned toward her, lowering his voice. "She's still agitated. I don't think she's going to calm down anytime soon." Claire sighed, glancing over at Samantha. "I know. We need to make sure she doesn't cause any more disturbances. Can you stay with her and keep things as calm as possible? I'll check in with the captain and see if we need to take any extra precautions." Daniel gave a slight nod. "I'll do my best." Claire turned and made her way to the front of the plane, slipping quietly into the cockpit. Captain Samuel Harris turned in his seat, his expression serious. "What's the situation, Claire?" he asked. "We've managed to de-escalate for now," Claire replied, though her tone was cautious. But the woman, Samantha, she's still convinced Marcus is a threat. Even after he showed his badge and medication, she's convinced he's lying. "I'm worried she might cause another scene." The captain frowned. "We can't risk another outburst. If this escalates, it could lead to panic. If necessary, we may need to restrain her for the remainder of the flight." Claire nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I'll keep a close eye on her. Daniel's watching her now. We'll do everything we can to avoid using restraints, but we'll be ready if it comes to that." Captain Harris gave her a small nod. "Keep me informed. If things get worse, we'll notify air traffic control and have security waiting when we land." Claire left the cockpit, her mind racing with contingency plans. She had to find a way to keep Samantha calm and prevent further disruption. Returning to the rear of the plane, Claire found Daniel standing near Samantha's seat, arms folded but relaxed. As Claire approached, Samantha's eyes flicked up, flashing with defiance. "So are you here to apologize?" To admit I was right? Claire kept her voice even but firm. No, ma'am, I'm here to make sure you're okay. We need everyone calm and cooperative so we can reach our destination safely. Samantha's jaw tightened. Cooperative? You mean compliant. You want me to sit here and ignore a potential threat while you all play nice? I won't do it. I can't believe you're all falling for his lies. Claire took a steady breath. Mr. Hale isn't lying, ma'am. He's shown his credentials, and there's no indication of a threat. However, your behavior is becoming a concern for the other passengers. We need you to remain calm and in your seat. If you can't, we'll have to take further measures. Samantha's eyes narrowed. Further measures? What does that mean? Are you going to arrest me for trying to protect everyone on this plane? Claire met her gaze without flinching. Ma'am, we are responsible for the safety of everyone on board. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will have to restrain you for the remainder of the flight. Please stay calm and remain seated. For a moment, Samantha's eyes burned with anger, but something in Claire's tone struck a nerve. Samantha leaned back into her seat, still seething but keeping her voice low. Fine, but if something happens, it's on you. Claire nodded, relieved that Samantha seemed to be cooperating, at least for now. She exchanged a glance with Daniel, signaling for him to stay close by and return to her duties. As Claire moved down the aisle, Marcus Hale watched her approach. He had been quietly observing from his seat, aware of every movement and shift in the cabin's mood. When Claire reached his row, Marcus looked up, his expression calm but curious. How's it going back there? Marcus asked softly. Claire let out a quiet sigh. She's still upset, but she's staying in her seat for now. We're keeping a close watch. I'm sorry this has caused you so much trouble. We're doing everything we can to manage the situation. Marcus nodded. I know you are. You're handling it well. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Claire gave him a small smile. Just stay calm. The less we escalate, the better. Marcus returned to his book, but his senses stayed sharp. The cabin had quieted, but the tension still lingered beneath the surface. He could feel it, like a faint hum just out of reach, a reminder that this wasn't over. At the rear of the plane, Samantha sat rigidly, her mind racing. She couldn't understand why no one else saw the danger she believed was right in front of them. Her anger simmered, but she held it in, knowing that further outbursts would only make things worse. Daniel stood nearby, watching her closely. He saw the turmoil flicker in her eyes, the way her fists clenched and unclenched against the armrests. Minutes passed, and the cabin slowly settled. Claire moved through the aisles, offering smiles and checking on passengers, but she never stopped glancing back at Samantha. Marcus, still alert but composed, felt the unease ease slightly. Yet, he kept his book open more as a prop than for genuine distraction. He knew better than to assume the situation was fully resolved until the wheels touched the ground. Daniel stood near Samantha Brooks, his eyes fixed on her as she gripped the armrests tightly, as if holding herself back from doing something drastic. His posture was relaxed but alert, ready to step in if necessary. Minutes stretched into an hour as the plane settled into a quiet, tense rhythm. Passengers returned to their routines, flipping through books or scrolling through in-flight entertainment, while Claire made her rounds, discreetly monitoring both Marcus Hale and Samantha. Finally, Claire approached Daniel and leaned in with a quiet whisper. I think we're okay for now. Just keep an eye on her, and let me know if anything changes. Daniel nodded, his gaze never drifting from Samantha. Will do. Claire exhaled softly and walked back down the aisle, though her mind remained focused on keeping the situation under control. The flight pressed on, carrying everyone steadily toward their destination. Though calm for the moment, the tension still lingered, hanging in the air like an unwelcome passenger. Samantha stayed silent, her anger swirling beneath the surface, circling back to Marcus with every thought. From the corner of her eye, she kept him in sight. Marcus, for his part, remained composed, reading quietly but staying alert, knowing that his calmness was the best way to keep the peace. As the hours passed, the plane began its descent. A soft ding echoed overhead as the seatbelt sign illuminated, followed by the reassuring voice of Captain Harris announcing their approach to Los Angeles. Passengers began shifting in their seats, stretching and packing away belongings. The weight that had hung over the cabin for much of the flight seemed to lift slightly as the end of the journey neared. Marcus felt the slight tilt of the plane as it descended. He calmly closed his book, tucking it into his bag alongside his medication. Glancing over his shoulder toward the back of the plane, he caught sight of Samantha still seated, her posture rigid. Daniel hadn't left his spot, standing close by. Claire made one final pass through the aisle, checking seatbelts and ensuring everything was secure for landing. She paused briefly at Marcus's row and smiled softly. "We're almost there," she said quietly. "Thank you for everything." Marcus replied, nodding appreciatively. "I just want to get through this without any more trouble." Claire returned the nod. "Let's hope it stays quiet until we're on the ground." As she continued down the aisle, Daniel caught her attention with a subtle signal. Claire quickened her steps, her heart sinking slightly. When she reached him, Daniel's voice was low. "She's muttering to herself again? She's agitated. We need to be ready." Claire glanced at Samantha. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, face flushed with frustration. Claire knelt beside her, keeping her voice calm and soft. "Ma'am, we're about to land. I need you to stay calm and remain in your seat. We're almost there." Samantha's eyes flicked toward Claire, her voice a harsh whisper. "This isn't over. I'm not letting him get away with whatever he's planning. You'll see. You'll all see." Claire felt a chill ripple through her but forced a smile. "Let's get to the ground first. Please stay seated, and we'll address everything when we land." Samantha didn't respond, but she made no move to rise. Claire straightened, exchanging a glance with Daniel as she made her way back to the front. The city lights of Los Angeles sparkled below as the plane descended further, and the runway came into view. The aircraft touched down with a smooth glide, and a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the cabin. Seatbelts clicked open, and passengers stirred, the familiar rustling of bags filling the space as they prepared to disembark. Marcus remained seated, watching quietly as others began standing. Captain Harris's voice echoed through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off and we have arrived at the gate. We appreciate your cooperation and hope you enjoy your stay." Marcus glanced out the window, watching as the airport crew began their preparations for arrival. Claire approached his seat once more, her voice low. "We've contacted airport security. They'll be waiting when we reach the gate," she said. Marcus nodded. "That's probably the best approach. Thank you for handling this so professionally." Claire offered a soft but firm nod in return. "We'll make sure everything goes smoothly." As the plane rolled to a stop at the gate and the seatbelt sign flicked off, passengers eagerly rose from their seats, pulling down bags from overhead compartments. Claire and Daniel positioned themselves near Samantha, ready to intervene if necessary. Marcus remained seated, unhurried, as the murmur of conversations filled the cabin. The door opened, and the first wave of passengers began making their way off the plane. Through the open door, Marcus spotted two uniformed airport security officers standing just inside the terminal. Their calm but attentive postures told him they were well informed about the situation. Samantha hadn't moved yet, her eyes fixed forward, shoulders stiff. Claire gently touched her arm. "Ma'am, security will speak with you as you disembark. Please remain calm, and let's handle this peacefully." Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded curtly. Marcus watched as Claire and Daniel guided her toward the exit. She kept her composure, but Marcus could still see the tension etched across her face. As Marcus stepped into the aisle, following the last of the passengers, he glanced once more at Claire, offering her a small nod of appreciation. She returned the gesture. "Take care, Mr. Hale." "You too," Marcus replied, stepping off the plane and into the terminal, leaving the long and uneasy flight behind him. As the plane door opened, two uniformed security officers stepped inside, their calm, professional presence cutting through the lingering tension. Claire subtly motioned them toward the rear of the cabin, where Samantha Brooks sat stiffly, arms crossed and eyes still burning with defiance. One of the officers, a tall man with a measured and authoritative demeanor, approached her first. His voice was low and calm. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us. We'd like to have a word with you about the incident during the flight." Samantha's eyes widened. She shook her head vigorously. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done anything wrong. It's him. She pointed sharply at Marcus Hale, still seated a few rows ahead. He's the one you should be arresting. You're all ignoring the real threat. The officer remained composed. Ma'am, we just need to speak with you. If you could please come with us, we'll sort everything out. Samantha abruptly shot to her feet, her voice rising for the entire cabin to hear. You're protecting him. I'm the only one who sees the truth. Passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some leaning away in their seats. The second officer, a woman with a firm but calm expression, gently placed her hand on Samantha's arm. Ma'am, I need you to calm down. Please step off the plane with us, and we'll handle everything appropriately. Samantha tried to jerk her arm free, her voice cracking into a shrill protest. No, this isn't right. You can't do this. But the officers maintained their steady composure, guiding her toward the exit despite her resistance. Samantha's protests echoed through the cabin as she was carefully but firmly led off the plane. Some passengers watched in stunned silence, while others exchanged quiet sighs of relief that the ordeal was finally being resolved. Claire followed closely behind, ensuring that everything remained under control until Samantha was escorted fully into the terminal. Marcus Hale stayed seated, observing the scene with the quiet calm he had carried throughout the flight. He could feel the curious eyes of the remaining passengers on him, but he didn't let it rattle him. After a few moments, Claire returned to his side. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They'll take her to a holding area for questioning, Claire explained softly. The authorities have already been informed, so everything will be thoroughly checked. Marcus nodded, offering a polite smile. Thank you. I appreciate how you handled everything. You were professional through all of it. Claire returned the smile, albeit faintly. Just doing my job. I'm glad we were able to avoid anything worse. As the final passengers began disembarking, Marcus stood and retrieved his carry-on bag. The subtle tension that had gripped his shoulders eased slightly. He nodded once more to Claire before stepping into the aisle. Take care, Claire. Thanks again. You too, Mr. Hale. Safe travels. The cool air of the jet bridge greeted Marcus as he stepped into the terminal. The soft hum of airport life washed over him like a reminder that the world beyond the plane carried on without concern for what had just transpired. As he walked toward baggage claim, Marcus's eyes flicked to the left, where he spotted Samantha being escorted further into the terminal by the two officers. Her voice, though quieter, still carried a sharp edge as she argued with them. Marcus watched for a moment as they disappeared around a corner, her protests fading into the ambient noise of the airport. He turned and continued walking, his steps steady and measured. The events of the flight lingered in his mind, but he felt no anger, just the weight of another encounter with misunderstanding and misplaced fear. Marcus had faced worse before. He knew how to carry it. Reaching the baggage claim area, he exhaled deeply and leaned against the rail, waiting for his luggage. Around him, other passengers from the flight trickled in, murmuring quietly among themselves. A few glanced in his direction but quickly looked away. The tension from the flight was dissolving, gradually replaced by the familiar hum of airport life and the anticipation of reaching a new city. Marcus knew his day wasn't over. There would be reports to file, calls to make, and inevitable questions to answer. But for now, as he stood among the swirl of travelers, he let the airport noise wash over him. Life kept moving, even after moments of conflict and misunderstanding. Marcus walked toward the exit, feeling a quiet sense of resolve. Today had been challenging, but he had faced it with patience and professionalism. And in the end, that was all anyone could do.